Good evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. My name is 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐑𝐞𝐬𝐿. Tonight we focus on two elements. One, the toddler that has just come in Somalia, but two, the East African community, how far? The 23rd summit that happened last week, where the heads of state sat and admitted Somalia into the East African community. It's 24 years. What has the East African community done for its member states? When we look along the parameters, the 4 parameters that it's supposed to be under, the customs union, the common market, the political federation, and finally the monetary union. What have they done? What have these states achieved? When we look at the newest entrant and also the new chairperson, where it has moved from the president of Burundi to the president of South Sudan, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐑𝐞𝐬 is the new chairperson. It was referred to as the Switzerland of Africa. In '91, it went into shambles. It has had one crisis after another. If we're talking about terrorism, humanitarian, and we're talking about debt, famine, the worst famine that has happened to Somalia in the last 40 years. The biggest question is, what does it bring to the table? Or what does East Africa have to offer to Somalia? We interrogate East Africa community there, and we also interrogate Somalia. With 300 million market people there in the whole region there, what does that mean? A GDP combined of $240 billion. Are we moving anywhere? We also want to look at the toddler called DRC. How much has it benefited from this region, especially when we look at the blockades that have been there? Let me get to the people that will be interrogating this discussion tonight and more. I'll start on my extreme left. He is a flight captain. Francis Babu has been around, has flown the East African Airways, but right now he's a senior citizen, and he'll be discussing both in hindsight of what it used to be, what it is, and what we hope it will be. Next to him, he is a new entrant, making his maiden appearance on our show tonight. Professor Ibrahim, he is here tonight to be able to discuss that, the economics of that. He is the dean at the School of Economics at Makerere University. When we're discussing anything economics, we always think about him. Dr. Fred Muhumza is with us tonight, the director of the Economic Forum at MUBS. He'll be bringing perspective of Omuntu the businesses, the small medium enterprises. What can they benefit from this block? Or what should Somalia be hoping for in this discussion? Lastly but not least, she's the lady that we always call upon to put perspective on what an individual would be expecting from such a blockade. Professor Sarah Sari, the dean at the Gender and Women Studies at Makerere University, she'll be bringing perspective in that area. Finally, we'll also be having one Honorable Mukasa Fred Mbide, who is a former 2-time term member of parliament at the East African Legislative Assembly, but also doubles as the vice president of the Democratic Party. He'll be answering some of those questions there. We'll also have a political analyst all the way from Kenya later on to give us perspective of what edge Kenya has had over the rest of the East African states, part of this bloc, to be able to benefit. You can be part of the show. Go to our YouTube channel, let us know what you think, or go to our X platform, drop your comment, and let us know what you think. Hashtag UBC Behind the Headlines, or you can text us, WhatsApp us on 0709 62 25 92. Let us know what you think. My first question will be right from here, and we'll go straight to Captain Francis Babu. With the experience you have had, Captain, when you look in hindsight, both from 1967 to 1977, and now coming on to this new bloc that has been around for 24 years, compare them for us and give us a bit of perspective, both in the political, the social, and the economic of both regions, both blocks between 67 to 77, and now these 24 years.
Thank you very much, and good evening to our viewers, good evening to our panelists, and thank you for having us. You are asking me a very big, very wide question. But I think to give our viewers and even the panelists a nice startup is to go back and look at the word federation. The word federation in the colonial time was a very common word. And the most successful one was the northern and southern Rhodesia and Nyasaland. They created a federation. They tried to create a federation in East Africa, in 1948 onwards, but there was a lot of resistance. And therefore the federation never came. In fact, the refusal of that federation created a lot of bad politics for us. So going on, when the British failed to do that, they started something called the East African Common Services Organization. Of the three countries, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanganyika at that time, and Zanzibar. The East African Common Service Organization did give us certain services. One of them was the lorries, the East African Airways, the East African Harbours, the East African Shipping Line, and a few other things that went with that. Now, the East African Common Service Organization eventually became the East African Community. The East African Community went on, in fact, it took everything that was in the East African Common Service Organization with more strength, now pushing for the East African Federation. And of course in 1970, was it 76? They eventually reached an end and they unbundled then the East African Community. It is until recently that the Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania try to revisit and start the East African Community all over again. And this is the East African Community we are talking about now, where new countries are joining, and that was one of the aims, to bring in the other countries. But very quickly, a quick perspective I must give you. After independence, a lot of African countries wanted the unity of Africa. Nkrumah wanted the United States of Africa. Nyerere and others wanted to have blocks, the East African Community, West African, Northern and Southern organizations. Now, the question is whether we can look at the two, where we are talking about the United States of Africa and the East African Community, which was a block of East Africa, the SADC, the West African group, the Maghreb in the north, and so on and so forth. When you look at that, you begin to wonder who was right at the time. Was Nyerere and his group that said we should start with small blocks and build them slowly, or we should start with the whole of Africa becoming one? Gaddafi had that dream with the African unity, and in fact changed the name for the African group and called them the African Unity, AU. So now we come to East Africa. Should we have remained Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, or should we have added on? And therefore adding on means what? A few minutes ago you were talking about one of the areas where the population is big and therefore the market and therefore the economy. But what are the politics of having these joining together? There is a lot of people who are skeptical, especially with a few other countries joining, Southern Sudan, Somalia, and the DRC. So the politics of those. The economy, the numbers sounds good. I'm sure the economists will be happy with 300 million as a market. The question, will the politics be able to sustain that group? So when you talk about the 300, we should not only use numbers to create that community. We should think about its joining together and therefore creating a strong body that is going to help the people in those countries. A lot of people, including myself, I've got this thinking that the three countries should have created a federation before adding on new countries. It's going to become very difficult to add on more countries and therefore create a federation. In fact, as we talk now, there is a group within those countries that says, no, let's start with a confederation. A confederation basically means there is less power at the center and more power in the states. So one has to sit down and think, is this bringing this country together politically viable? Or are we going to have more problems? We already have the Congolese problem. We still have this, that Mogadishu problem is not small. The Southern Sudan still has a lot of problems. The other countries, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, seems to be hanging in there. But even then, they still have their own problems, politically. So one then sits down and says, yes, we congratulate Mogadishu for having joined the East African community. We now have a very big, we had a small conflict, now the conflict is bigger. How are we going to manage that conflict? Taking the conflict theory, are we going to be able to manage the conflict within the East African community? So, quickly, I would like to say this, that actually, it is good to have those countries join, theoretically. The question is, do we have the capacity to manage the conflict?
And sticking with you, Captain Francis, before I come to the rest of the panelists, the issues between 1967 and 1977, have they been resolved, especially between the three, before we expand to now 8?
No. In fact, the issue was only one. It was a political problem. Their political management was poor. It was working very well, by the way. Let me give you an example of the airline. The airline deficit was only about $50 million. Deficit of a very powerful airline that even Ethiopian Airlines had a problem to compete with. Now, you now have these countries, each one of them has got an airline. Each one of them has got their own levy system. Each one of them has got their postal system. We had one of each of those, and we controlled them very well. Now, the question, what they had built, the foundation they had laid, they broke it. To build it back, it's not going to be very easy. It's very simple. When you build, when you break a house, it takes one day. To build it takes a long time. The question is, as we are building the new East African community, how far can we go with the kind of conflicts that exist?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me come to you, Professor Okumu, especially in the economic part there. You and Dr. Mhumza, especially when we look at the small and medium enterprises, which I will bring in Dr. Mhumza there. When you look at the economics, 24 years, look at Kenya, let's talk about DRC. When it joined, especially Kenya stepped in with banking and all these things in there. We have countries in waiting like Ethiopia to join this federation. What do you make of the economics, especially of these 8 member states, now where we are?
Thank you, Timothy, and thank you once again for hosting me here. And I'm glad to speak about the economics herein. The most important thing for us here is to look at these countries individually. And individually, if you look at a country like DRC with a GDP of 67 billion, and then you look at a country like Somalia with a GDP of 11 billion US dollars. And of course, when you go to figures like GDP per capita, for all the 8 countries, the GDP per capita averages about 900 US dollars. To suggest that individually, none of those countries can be attractive to a significant investment per se. To the extent that if you are to have a massive investment, it would require that we look at the ESC as a single market. And with that, why I'm comfortable with these other countries coming on board is to the extent that we can have this massive market that can be attractive to investment. But one thing I need to say is that with the ESC in place, it's not all about bringing different countries together. To attract investment, there must be harmonization of policies across the board. Captain Babu just spoke about the disintegration of the East African airlines. I would suggest that where we are now, Uganda Airlines, 𝐘𝐞, Tanzania, Rwanda, you know, what you are having is what one can call costly operations. However, when you bring those airlines together and you operate as an East African Airways, what you basically have is a reduction in the unit cost of production, and the cost of service delivery will become lower. The ticket prices will become lower, and with that, you cease to have cross-border airspace taxes. And that feeds into the ticket that you pay for air services. Now, what that speaks to is competitiveness as a region. Now, beyond that, if you look at the ESC as a region as well, for you to make use of the economies of scale that come with bring the different economies on together, it is important that you look at the education regions across the region as one, such that you cease to have 844 in Kenya, you cease to have 763 in Uganda or 763 in Tanzania. Rather, you have a systematic curriculum development framework, and with that, you equally tend to have uniform, uniform, I would say, agencies that monitor the different disciplines across the region, be it lawyers, be it doctors, be it architects, be it engineers. Now, the advantage with that is that you have common practices across the board, you have free movement of labor across the board, because you are aware that whoever is graduating at Makerere University as an engineer, or whoever is graduating at the University of Nairobi as an engineer, the standards are the same. If you come to quality standards, you know, when you produce mwana mujimu in Uganda and you're exporting it to Tanzania, you're not sure whether it will cross the border because of conflicting quality standards. So merely joining countries is not enough. Again, you need uniformity in quality standards. So I do believe that when we harmonize quality standards, we can be in position to leverage the 8 economies that would come in place and move the region forward. But let me say this. We are bringing economies with different levels of security together. And security and economy move hand in hand. With the kind of security we have in Somalia, it does not matter how much tourism packages you will sell as a region. Nobody would be interested to move there. But having said that, as a region, it is incumbent upon us to pacify Somalia, because there are opportunities in there that Uganda as a country and the ESC as a region can leverage. Look at South Sudan. When it joined the ESC, Uganda was one of the beneficiaries on account of movement of commodities to South Sudan, and indeed South Sudan could be one of the leading export destinations for Ugandan goods. To suggest that we need those economies, no matter how small they are, we are better off as an ESC. But most importantly is that there must be harmonization of policies across the board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Let me come to, and we have been joined by Honorable Fred Mukasambidde to be able to discuss two-term Member of Parliament with the East African Legislative Assembly, but also doubles as the Vice President of the Democratic Party. Let's jump into it straight away. 24 years of this bloc. What benefits? What learnings? You have been at the helm of it. One of the concepts that was brought in by Captain Francis Babu, confederation, federation. Help us understand where we are. Is this an experiment? Is it a dream? Is it reality? Is it a fallacy? Your take, Honorable.
Thank you very much. First of all, I apologize. I have arrived late. I think what we are looking at, we are trying to attempt, as the East African community, to use all the weapons necessary to make sure we break into the barriers to integration. It is not a very easy phenomenon. The East African community obviously is making achievements. When you hear the captain talking about a confederation, of course that is then another delaying tactic to what ultimately would have been the ultimate aim of a federation itself. But we are dealing with the very enthusiastic, nationalistic individuals in these countries that define every entity using lenses of nationalism. There is something they call sovereignty. I have personally, even as an advocate of courts of judicature, been arguing with the attorneys generals before the East African Court of Justice, to the extent that for every violation you take to the court, the attorneys general now begin to argue sovereignty as a defense, that courts cannot for that purpose order sovereign states to do certain activities and attempts because genuinely they believe these are sovereign states. They are forgetting that appending a signature to a treaty establishing a community is itself an act of sovereignty. Therefore, sovereignty cannot then be used as a defense against compliance with what the treaty provides for. Ultimately, what I am trying to tell you is the East African community is not a country. It is majorly several countries, but engaging themselves into substantive negotiations for purposes of creating a country. What have they done so far? For purposes of customs, the East African community is a country. I am not talking about, of course, the exigencies of establishing a customs union or a single customs territory, which include, among others, of course, the non-tariff barriers. But we are considering that for customs purposes, the East African community is a single country. For monetary purposes, we have appended, of course, there are substantive normative instruments to which these several countries have appended signatures. As to whether its applicability is yet, of course, we are still following steps. But at least for purposes of markets, we are saying that for purposes of markets, and of course within the precincts of the East African Community Common Market, it is one country. But then, of course, we are considering annexes. The annexes to the Common Market Protocol that include, among others, of course, those that actualize the implementation of Article 13 and 14 on land. We know that land is still a matter that is not a cooperation area. So the East African community has no cooperation at all on matters to do with land. Those we are now preserves of partner state territorial decisions to be made. Therefore, we are still having, of course, steps forward and steps backwards. For purposes of political, the East African community is still a multiplicity of countries. There are now 8 for political reasons. And I have had a lot of people, even professors, arguing that when they went to Kenya or Tanzania or anywhere, they faced questions. What have you come to do and for how long? And they begin arguing as if East Africa is one country. It is not. And I think, let me tell you frankly, it is not. But negotiations are underway for purposes that the 4th limb of integration, which is political federation, will then be, of course, reached. Now, when you find them, instead of getting to a federation now, adopting a confederation, which is a step a bit backwards, but which is more believable and achievable, then you know that the heads of state are also now beginning to say, what can we do anywhere in the circumstances now that we can't achieve the other? And we begin now arguing. So for economic purposes, we are saying, yes, there is progress. More other countries are entering. Somalia, as of Tuesday, we are saying now we are 8 countries. We used to be 7. I have found my brother here also giving, of course, further ideas on what actually we stand to benefit as the East African community. So I think there is progress. but we are still dealing with the exigencies of integration, which we are yet again to explain to the public.
And Honorable, sticking with you before I get to Dr. Mhumza, you talk about things like, you know, applicability. It's 24 years. What needs to be applied that can fail in 24 years? Two, let's put a yardstick. These 4 pillars: customs union, common market, political federation, monetary union. How far have we gone?
Yes. I am not the kind of person that will come here and begin to adumulate success stories of integration. It is not my nature. But I'll keep telling you frankly where we have actually. I have found my colleagues speaking about standards. For example, we have got a policy. The East African Community enacted, I think in 2006, a standardization, quality assurance, metrology, and testing center act, testing act. But the centers are not really. When you ask for a list of standards, you find that, of course, then implementation is still lacking. We have a substantive regional policy on competition. For example, we have got a 2006 Competition Act of the East African Community. But when you find the partner states themselves now have not actualized, in Uganda for over 37 years, we don't have a Competition Act. So what happens is that when we establish at a bedrock of the region, when there is established a regional consideration of a policy, it is incumbent upon the substantive partner states to actualize the implementation of the same. So the weaknesses that also now obtain at the ground are also, of course, they are making it, of course, integration itself now gets hindered. In Uganda, I have heard, because I'm, as a practicing advocate, I am so much into mergers and acquisitions, and I have seen that in Uganda we have had a lot of mergers, acquisitions of substantive companies, but we don't have a competition law. So where is the protection of the consumer in this? Now, when the consumer...
Just for information,
yes,
it is actually, they have been grappling with it. It is there, but it has never been passed.
Never. And every parliament actually concludes its business without passing one. So there is no protection to a consumer. Now, when you hear that the East African Community Business Council, for example, and the Council of Ministers have sat and established a common external tariff above 35%, for purposes that, of course, then we are now promoting local production and curtailing imports. And now, with the effect of having prices increase, I have seen we have got economists here. Already we are dealing with the international commodity price volatility that are being caused because of course, the exigencies of external wars, Russia, Ukraine. You know that naturally we are dealing with this. And of course, even COVID. There are natural price volatilities established under those natural circumstances. But at the same time, you find that ministers and the Business Council, those are profit-oriented. Ministers, they represent tax collectors. Now, when they sit and establish a standard that actually is aimed at increasing prices without telling you a list of commodities produced in East Africa, because which country has got a list of industries whose production level is actually being protected, then you know that prices are again under the third limb being increased. The economists know that then we still are dealing with a fourth, the contangos, arbitragoires, these ones that actually also hold the commodities and stocks and what for purposes of, for contemplation of a future price rise. You find that now, whatever we are gaining under economies of integration, the substantive states are not planning for their own citizens. Where that happens, you may not see what we have benefited. That doesn't mean that ultimately integration itself cannot be used to achieve. So it is a catch-22 situation. Governance programs must be geared towards the citizens benefiting from the economies of integration. Per se, integration itself is heaven on earth. But if sinners exist, then that is a problem. They don't enter.
Just want to add on something there. The antitrust laws or competition laws are very important for the private sector. Private sector, the regulator cannot control the private sector without those laws.
Thank you. Dr. Mhumza, we seem to be quantitative with no quality. We are growing to 8. It seems we have not learned from our history on what the problems are. But we have also seen aflatoxins, closing of milk to go to Kenya. DRC, we have a symposium in Goma. As private sector foundation goes there, Kenya actually puts a bank there. Is this East African bloc economically viable?
Yes, thank you, and good evening, our viewers and panelists. It's really a question of what are you putting together to even speak of it being economically viable. If each of the individual countries is struggling, the Kenyan economy has been one of the strongest in the region. Now we see a lot of events there. Their shilling is losing value, prices are going up, and government is really struggling to find money from anywhere to patch up, pay its debts. You're not even raising the taxes to improve the condition of the citizens, because the citizens are saying cost of living has gone up. Thank God the High Court ruled some of the clauses that have been affecting citizens unconstitutional. So we hope they will find sanity in how to move forward. So you have struggling economies across the region. Now, even when you bring them together, you're going to find a problem of viability of the whole that you have put together when the individual countries were struggling to be viable. And in any integration of this nature, there is always a matriarch elephant, the big country that holds out to the others. And in the region, we have been saying that should be Kenya. But now Kenya, which is supposed to take lead, is also having a problem. In the European Union, you will have Germany take lead. When Greece was having problems, Italy had problems, Spain had problems, really Germany held everybody together. Now, who is the lead here in this particular area we're talking of? We are simply adding on numbers. Now there are 8. So how many? 400 million people. It's not about people, it's about the systems
490.
that you are bringing together, and those systems are not there. It's a nightmare to move within Uganda itself, leave alone to cross to the DRC. We have been reading about the challenges the UPDF have, just getting into 80, 100 kilometers of Congo, which is really shorter than Kampala to Masaka. So what are you bringing together if your closest across the border, you can't even reach them? I know majority of the Canadians live within 100 kilometers, 100 miles of the US-Canadian border. So there is an integration there and business to do. When you come to us here, what are we bringing together? It's a good intention that we want to, I don't know which future we are talking about here, because when I look at, as you said, since 1999, when these acts were passed, we are still like where we began. Because one of the fundamental principles of the community was mutual trust, political will, and sovereign equality. And I think the only thing we have picked up is sovereign equality, because any of them can be leader. Burundi has just been the leader. So there is equality. It's not about geographical size, population size, no. You will be a leader. But when you come about political will and trust, as soon as DRC joined us, the war has been there. Now you can't even trade across there easily. Peaceful settlement of disputes. As Uganda, we are still struggling to pay the debt we owe to DRC. Yet after them coming in, we would have reconciled and found, how do we settle this dispute? It happened, there was an international court, but we can still solve it within our own East African region. When we had struggles with the Rwanda-Uganda border, who came in to mediate? Certainly we didn't find mechanisms within the EAC to mediate. We had to run out there. Peaceful coexistence and good neighborliness. These are things that were stated 24 years ago. Up to today, you still don't find fundamental structures that you can count on and say, not only will they resolve the disputes, but they will even prevent the disputes arising. If you get to Southern Africa, there is what they call the Southern Africa Customs Union. They will collect revenue and say, Eswatini, which former Swaziland, you're a small country. So apart from your local revenues that you raise internally, the 𝐓𝐡𝐞, which is the Southern African Customs Union, will add you more money. Because we are trying to get to equality for those brothers and sisters in the grouping whose ability at that point in time may not be so good, so that they can begin to pick those benefits. And as you said, when you're talking about the common person, where is the benefit? And I've been teaching integration, regional integration. And the thing we are struggling with my students, and I'm giving them a lot of material to read, is how do you compute these benefits? Why should a Somali person be happy that we have joined, when the Ugandan who has been there for all these years has little or nothing to show for having been part of this EAC? Because now you can see people struggling to get into the European Union, especially after Russia attacked Ukraine. We saw so many countries running in because they know here, once I'm in, security is covered. So what is it that, as a professor here has mentioned, I would be happy to say, now that Somalia has joined, I can freely go to Makerere University, I can freely go to Moi University or Dar es Salaam University and be treated equally there. So you still have challenges of making this a reality. So for now, all we are counting is the number of states and the population. In terms of economics, it's still a far-fetched cry for me to find a tangible thing that I can go and tell a Ugandan, can we clap our hands that Somalia has joined us? That is still a far cry for me.
And before I get to Professor Sarah, the economic disparities, the economic structures in these individual countries, the protectionism, especially when the milk is low here and you're trying to export it, but you have volumes that are very high. This block is meant to be a cushion for the economics of the countries there. Where are the challenges and how can we resolve them?
I think the biggest challenge is still political. Because for any, whether it's economics, whether it is security, the political will to make it happen is critical. We saw when the British had their own differences. The politicians took a different trend, then they threw a referendum out there, and they are still limping on and struggling with it. So the political will to say, let me serve my personal interest now for the benefit of the bigger whole. You still have, as Honorable has put it, individual states. When it comes to an individual state, you first protect yourself. We have been in meetings at the EAC to agree on certain taxes. To say, let's put a common external tariff to guard the region against competition from out there. Now, as you come back, you'll find some other countries having unilaterally, on their own, varied what was a position agreed upon at the EAC. We are signing double taxation agreements as individual countries. And they are giving preferential trade with countries outside the EAC without even any consultation or discussion with the EAC membership. So you still have a lot of individualism as countries, and until we jump over that hurdle to begin looking at the bigger whole, even if it means let me lose a little bit here. I wouldn't want to get into the other conversation. The competition issues have been raised here. And we have seen countries, investors move in and out of different jurisdictions. But I'm yet to see many investors, there are few. I'm yet to see many investors who are coming into the East African region simply because there is a population that is that big and that there is harmony within the countries. They still come and say, I'm going to Kenya. Reason is I can freely cross over into Uganda and sell my products. And the last time I saw the numbers which had been given by URA, we had lost a lot of revenue because of that free trade. Now, who is going to compensate us for that? Those are the dynamics you want to get into to say, now that Kenyan goods can come to Uganda tax-free, how do we compensate Uganda? There would have been a common structure that looks into these benefits to say, a lot of Kenyan goods have gone into Uganda. Kenya, therefore, you have earned more in terms of these benefits. How do we get a little bit of those benefits and share them out with the other countries? And they don't have to come to Uganda. You can say, well, Uganda, you're strong enough, let's share them with Burundi. We know one of the reasons that we really dragged on the discussions of Brexit, Britain leaving the European Union, was the big contribution Britain was making Because the big ones are taxed to make a contribution to go and benefit the small ones. Have we reached those levels? Are we getting to those levels? We are still in the very, very peripheral stages, 24 years down the road, that you don't see a sense of direction of an economic and security. Because for me, as Prof has mentioned, if we could resolve the economics and security, like you know now, any European country knows I cannot be attacked by a fellow European Union member. Is that a question we can tick here? I'm not very sure.
That's a very good question. We'll be getting to that. Prof, let me come to you. From you have really traveled, at least this block, quite a bit. From Bujumbura to Kigali to Dar es Salaam to Kampala to Juba to all these blocks of a country. When you meet individuals as citizens, do we have an understanding of what this East African community is all about?
Well, thank you, Timothy, and good evening, our viewers, and good evening, fellow panelists. I think, first of all, from what people have said, when you have such regional intentions, or regionalization will always raise the contestation between, do we go with the bigger bloc, which is the region, or the country? Might the republic get lost in the region, in the bigger bloc? And so some of the things members have discussed relate to countries fearing to lose their identity within the bigger whole. And yet, as people who are aspiring to the East African Federation, you want to build one thing which will finally end up with the political union. So already there will be that. I think we need to sort, what do we want? And maybe if we cannot go to where we shall lose our national identity, then maybe the confederation that Honorable Captain Francis Babu talked about earlier could be the solution. The issue is identifying what do we want. The other question we need to ask is what is bringing us together? Why do we federate? I know people here have discussed what are the stumbling blocks to the federation. But the issue is what is bringing us together? Is it shared values? That we actually have similarity of values, therefore debating this and debating the other should not actually rise? Or is it the fear of threat? You know, each time people talk about, you see, then there's no fear. I mean, anyone in the EU will be, you know, that they will be protected in case there's a threat. So is what is bringing us together? Shared values, shared interests, or the fear of threat in terms of terrorism and all the other things. I think if we identify what it is that's bringing us together, some of these matters will be resolved. When our president was pushing for the East African community, he has always emphasized three things. One is prosperity for the African people. Captain Francis Babu started with that when he even cited the issues of Kwame Nkrumah. One of the reasons people federate is actually, come together, is prosperity. And this has been articulated in all political circles across different historical epochs, that unless Africa unites, we are actually going to be shortchanged in this global trade. The other thing has been strategic security. The other thing has been commonalities of the East African people. So if what is bringing us together is that commonality and the shared values, then where is the problem? Okay? The problem actually seems to be more the fear of the loss of our national identity within the bigger bloc. Because if at all, as Honorable Mukasa Mbide said, if at all we ever achieve East Africa as a country, then what happens to the individuals within that? So even the political leaders who we may be seeing as a problem are battling with that. Then when you come to the people, who do the people make a social contract with? They are making a social contract with their leaders. So while people here may be sitting and aspiring to a bigger bloc, the person knows Honorable so-and-so, Honorable so-and-so, my house got blown away, my child doesn't have a job, the other one is sick. So then the country, when all that amalgamates, it makes its way to the national leader. The national leader is there, being met by people who are traders, by people who are in charge of security, by people who have certain regional interests. And at the end of the day, how does the national leader meet these kinds of things within a regional bloc? So that becomes the dilemma for the regional leader. Now let us come to the issue with the small people, the we's. Actually, actually the people on the ground don't have to understand what you're debating about with the regional corporation, because they have always collaborated. I was reading some of the statistics of the famine early warning system and the East African Grain Council. And these are people, these are organizations that are tracking informal cross-border trade within the East African region. And it is interesting how metric tons of grain and cattle are moved across the region between countries. And they have the bigger report per country, and they are tracking maize, they are tracking sorghum, they are tracking wheat, they are tracking millet. So while we here sitting thinking there's a problem, people on the ground are trading on their bicycles, they are trading on their lorries, they are trading on their backs. Why? Because people have always collaborated across the border. People have always traded across the border, whether you're talking about Uganda and DRC. Even when we run One Health programs, there's an issue there, movement of cattle and grain between Uganda and Tanzania. Many of our borders, I mean, Kenya, and of course Tanzania, our borders are porous, okay? So the people are moving. But when they move, actually, then they interface or they encounter the political restriction, where someone then reminds you, you cannot come into Uganda with these 5 kilograms of sugar because you see you are imported, they did not import them properly, you have to pay tax. Or you cannot take these bunches of bananas into Kenya because there's tax. So on the ground, actually, people are moving. They don't have to understand whether there was East African community or not. These people have always moved across communities. Actually, the political machinations of the nation state are actually an encumbrance to their regionalization. Because if they were not there, these people would be moving. They moved. We have always argued that our borders are artificial, that they are colonial creation. So why is it that when we talk regionalism, everyone puts up the walls? Actually, the walls should be coming down if we believe they are colonial creations and their commonalities across these peoples and these border communities. Then those should be coming down. So to your question of do people understand, they don't have to understand to collaborate, because they have always collaborated, whether we are discussing the East African Federation or it's not. But of course, if we then decide that that is not enough collaboration, we want to make it bigger, we then need to sensitize them and make sure that we stop having political machinations, tax regimes, economic regimes as a barrier, because it is obvious that people want to collaborate, that people want to network. So I think the challenge is one of national identity. The challenge is about the accountability of the leaders to their people and how to meet those needs. But if we really focus on the commonalities of the people, of course with the issue of the strategic security, common market, there shouldn't be a problem. And it is interesting that we are having this debate when we are discussing a country which is more integrated in the East African region than any other country. If you go to East Kenya, it's a very big Somali community. And the other day I was reading that actually within themselves, the volume of trade and the accounts for around 37% of the Kenyan economy. You come to Uganda, you also have a big Somali community, whether they are refugees or not, they are big. You go to Tanzania, you go to South Africa, they are just taking up all the other. That's why there's a lot of xenophobia against them. So it is interesting that we are discussing this to a country that has, or to a people who have demonstrated that borders don't work for them. That whichever country they are in, they do collaborate as a community, they do trade, and they do prosper. Maybe actually we have something to learn from them. But I think the people are trading, and for me, I think beyond trade, beyond cultures, I mean, we share a lot of cultural things. When the Bagisu, for example, are circumcising, the others come from Kenya, the others come from Kasese. When things are happening with the Rwanzururu, there are those who come from the other. So some of these borders are artificial. People are moving. I think let us stop, if we are serious about the East African Federation, let us stop putting across artificial barriers, because we are an encumbrance to the people federating.
Before we even take a break, Professor, you have said very many things. It seems like these individual countries are playing catch up. The people in Busia are already trading with the people across. People in Kisoro are trading with the ones in Rwanda. Isinjiro, which has yet recently, Matoke is already crossing Tanzania. If they're playing catch up, yes, Honorable Babu.
Start with him first.
Let me start with Honorable Mbide.
I have a lot of respect for big men.
Yes.
So they're the ones playing catch up.
Thank you. What the professor is raising is correct. One person once asked me why we admitted South Sudan into the integration process. My answer was, the admission is generally paper-based, but the fact that East Africans were already in South Sudan is a given. They were already there trading. Now, this is something that I would like viewers to note. Even during the times when such East Africans were trading in South Sudan, as a practicing advocate, I go to traders whose contracts had not been honored by the government of South Sudan and certain traders. And they wanted me to generally assist them for purposes of enforcing a payment mechanism because they had not been paid. In their opinion, I would have to run to the East African court. Now, that is when I discovered that actually I had no help to give at the moment. Because South Sudan was not a member, it was therefore out of jurisdiction of the East African Court of Justice. So there was no enforcement mechanism for payment purposes. If the government chose not to pay, if traders chose not to pay, and we didn't have bilateral relations that established a tribunal, thank you, you are losing money. In fact, it is government that later on started working out a mechanism of having them paid. So the intra-trade between East Africans before a country is admitted to the EAC does not have a legal basis. And generally the admission therefore provides the legal framework for enforcement of contracts. So that is something that I needed people to note, that it is extremely important that countries are admitted so that then there is a basis for cooperation between the traders. Number two, consciousness of persons on matters of integration is stage-based. That is what people need to know. It is not anything that anybody can see or touch. But stages where we reach, for example, those that are involved get to know that it exists. What do I mean? When you are importing sugar, for example, for purposes of making beer, and somebody is importing sugar for purposes of selling the same, then you know that one of them is subject to the customs procedure code. You'll be exempted because then you are importing it as a raw material. The seller, a retail trader of sugar, will not be exempted, and accordingly we will know that if the East African community has not issued a gazette that exempts you, you will pay tax. Now, the compliance and of course those that will not pay will begin to understand that actually integration works. The problem is where ultimately by chicanery, somebody's company which actually trades in sugar finds itself on the exemption list when actually it should have paid. And those are the things I have been dealing with in courts of law. Now that is where East Africans again get lost. I say, but how? This trader is on the exemption list when actually he's not a manufacturer of anything that requires the sugar as a raw material. Those are things I have been dealing with.
Okay. Captain Francis, briefly before
I would like us to get away from symptoms of what's happening because we are trying to integrate. I want us to really talk about integration. And I was looking at the communique which was made on the 25th. And each president spoke. And I liked the one of the president of Somalia, what he said. One of the things, we just have to wake up. Can you please undo Berlin? Berlin made these boundaries. Berlin wanted to rule us. Berlin wanted to suck all the riches from us. Africans have to get away from the elite of our society who live with the people in Berlin. We must remove Berlin. Therefore, let's go to Arusha and declare that those boundaries made in Berlin must be reviewed. Full stop. That's the political thing I was talking about. We seem to talk about symptoms of things we are trying to create, and they are not working simply because we've not got the crunch of the issue. Have we made everybody understand that our strength is in us uniting? President, somebody here talked about the language in this communique, that it is going to cement our relationship. That is what Nyerere did in Tanzania. He used the language to cement the unity of the Tanzanians. Can we do the same in all our countries? Can we unite these countries? The uniting factor is by the way, the day you people get united, European Union will go under the bed because they are frightened of you getting united. The more you get united, the more powerful you become, economically, socially, and everything you want to talk about. So, we must now understand, can we unite these countries?
Yeah.
Politically, these economics, they will follow. Once we are united and we become one, first of all, Somalia, the reason why you see people destabilizing, it's a very rich country. First of all, it's got that coastline. Second, it's got oil. Thirdly, it's got other riches. Now, people who are outside don't want Somalia to become stable. And the Africans want it to become stable. So we need to wake up. And then the Somali president talked about the race. All Africans are all the races of the Africans are integrated in this part of East Africa. The Hamites, the Bantus, the Nilotics, all these. Some of our very educated people, the professors, should tell us we are one. Whether you're a Somali, whether you're a Bantu, whether you're a Nilotic, we are one person. So we need to unite our people. Once we have united them politically, all the things you're talking about, these nice things, by the way, they did talk about the statute the East African Legislative Assembly has passed, and one of them was the competition law you were talking about. They are setting the competition authority. Now, for good, these are good things. They are happening. These are nice. We need them. But are they standing on a good base? Do we have a foundation where these things can stand? The problem you're having, you're creating good things, but they are not working simply because the base is not yet cemented into one. And that is what Madame was talking about. That the local people, for them, they already are together. We, the elite, are trying to create things that are not even working yet. But the man on the border, which is not even there, because the borders are only in certain places, the rest of the borders are porous. The Maasai in Tanzania is moving to Kenya. The Kenyan Maasai is moving there. The Musamia at the border of Uganda is moving and meeting there. The Acholi on the border there is moving up and down. You're talking about the people on the DRC border. They are brothers and sisters. The Sudanese right there, they are brothers and sisters.
Actually, 3 years ago,
yes,
going to Buko in Uganda,
you had to go via Kenya.
Stated that you go via Kenya.
Yes. That's from Uganda. It took 3 days.
Basically, what I'm saying,
Yes.
what Madame was saying is true.
Yes.
The people already know what they want. Let us create it for them and let them become East Africans.
Let's take a quick break because it seems the people have already led this federation, and hopefully it can catch up after this break.
Jovia ng'oyolekera ku lugendo luno olw'obulamu nkuwa ekirabo eky'amaanyi agataziizibwa, amaanyi okulabibwa n'okuwulirwa mu mawanga ageewala ennyo, okutuuka buli wamu nga yadde togenzeeyo, ensi yonna ng'ekuli mu ngalo. Okutambula mu biseera n'okumanya buli kimu ekirina okumanyibwa. Jovia, kino kye kirabo kyange gy'oli.
Tewali kkubo ku ki gy'osobola okukola ku mukutu nnandameggwa ogwa MTN.
Metu Bus Industries Namambe, the manufacturers of buses for transporters, schools, tour operators and special purpose vans. Metu Bus Industries offers a range of buses known for safety, comfort and reliability. Depending on your needs, a bus can simply be a point A to point B people mover with just seats or a special design that includes a restroom, power outlet, Wi-Fi, television and a refreshment center. Buy your buses from Metu and support industrialization of Uganda.
Jovia ng'oyolekera ku lugendo luno olw'obulamu nkuwa ekirabo eky'amaanyi agatazizibwa amaanyi okulabibwa n'okuwulirwa mu mawanga ag'ewala ennyo okutuuka buli wamu nga yadde togenzeeyo ensi yonna ng'ekuli mu ngalo okutambula mu biseera n'okumanya buli kimu ekirina okumanyibwa Jovia kino kye kirabo kyange gy'oli
tewali kkubo ku ki ky'osobola okukola ku mukutu nnandameggwa ogwa MTN.
Welcome back from that quick commercial break here on Behind the Headlines. Even as we get to this last leg of the show, we'll be discussing especially Somalia and also looking at solutions to this East African bloc. But let me get to some of your feedback here. A good evening to you all. I'd like to know the possible advantages of having one communal airport and also the disadvantages, okay? Someone else comes in and says, it's interesting, this is John Santos, it's interesting and unfortunate that the honorable panelists can comfortably sit there and discuss issues of integration. When you have a genocide happening in Eastern Congo, a war in both Somalia and South Sudan, a president in Burundi who supports genocides, an East African chairman who doesn't know the name and the countries of his fellow presidents, crying to our beloved East Africa and Africa. I have made my comments, but I doubt if we have the guts to read them. We have read them. Someone else goes on to say, a former student of East African law, it was just obvious that at the end of this course unit, we came to oblivious conclusions, that the East Africa is merely just a paper. I want to just give you basic comparisons. In Tanzania, Ugandan students pay, as foreigners, 10 times more tuition than Tanzanian students, and they pay it in dollars. In trade, Uganda was charged less than $40 for the road use for a truck, while Tanzania is charged 5 times more. The individual states are so powerful and more powerful than the East Africa states. The elections in the East African Parliament are a scam. The states are merely appointing people to keep their interests. Honorable Mbide versus the Attorney General of Uganda, of East Africa, look up that case, and the East African court is so weak that it has no notable milestones. Thank you, Behind the Headlines. Okay. Finally, Behind the Headlines, this is Fred from Wakiso. I have heard of the East African countries complaining about another East African country flooding their market with maize and milk and affected local producers. East Africa will be a reality if we collect all the surplus produce and sell it to China, the European Union, as East Africa. Why can't we negotiate with the big markets as East Africa rather than single countries? If the EU is negotiating with China as EU, why is East Africa waiting for? What is East Africa waiting for? Thank you very much. Keep your feedback coming. We'll be getting to some of it in a short while there. Let's get to solutions. And I'll start with Professor, who is next to me. People seem to be ahead of this block, already trading. How does this block catch up?
Yes, thank you, Timothy. I think the problem is when we sit, maybe this has occurred over time. We tend to, I don't want to say major in minors, but we tend to amplify the negatives and why things don't work. And that takes away, it saps energy away from focusing on what is working and how to strengthen it. So, and this is not just when we are talking about the East African community. I think it's generally how we discuss life in this part of the world, that we focus on the negative, we focus on what doesn't work, we are highly critical, and that blinds us to actually what is working. And this has also arisen because we focus a lot on politics and we do not see what else is taking place. So I think what we need to do is, the people have moved on. So as Captain Francis Babu is saying, why don't we make it easier for them to continue moving on? So what do we need to do? If you go to places like the Schengen area, which is the EU, I mean, each time they rotate which of the embassy gives you a visa, but once you enter one of them, you've entered all of them.
Schengen.
The Schengen area, okay, the Schengen border we call it, and we get a Schengen visa. Or when you are trading into one, once you enter into all of them. So first of all, we need to stop focusing on the negative and say what is working. What is working is this mobility of people. What is stopping the mobility of people? What is encumbering the mobility of people? Maybe we just don't have very good service provision at these borders, because the borders where the people are passing are obsessed with checking smuggling, because that's what they understand. They are not seeing this as a potential growth of anything. So can we change our frame from looking at it as smuggling to looking at it as trade? And when you look at it as trade, then you enable it. And if you want to tax or you want to find a way of making it more powerful, then you're looking at trade. So we need to change the lenses with which we look at the activities. The other thing we need to acknowledge is that our economies are small. So our economies are largely informal, okay? So there are those who are going to trade big, they are registered like those councils Dr. Muhumuza works in, but a lot of our people are informalized, and that reflects with even if they're not cross-border, our economies are informal. So maybe it's high time that we developed services that speak to that kind of economy with the intention of growing it up, because the more we categorize it as informal, the more we ignore it, the more it becomes invisible, then it can't be developed, so we don't see it. What we are seeing are the people who are registered, who are moving, who are the big taxpayers. But there's a lot of trade. Like I told you, grain between now and this year up to March alone, the first quarter, 195,000 metric tons of maize was traded amongst these countries, on bicycles, on foot, everywhere. And that is being tracked. But you see, in our formal calculation of grain trade, that will not be captured because it is informal. So if we acknowledge where we are as an economy and develop economic systems that track, taxation systems that track that kind of trade, then maybe we shall have a different way of looking at how much trade is going on in the East African community. Because when that statistic was being tracked as a threat to food security. It was not even being tracked as business that is taking place. So you have that. So the other thing we need to look at is to say, how then do we sensitize people to pick up with the East African spirit? Do we even know what the East African spirit is all about? And that's why I asked, what is it that brings us together? What is bringing the people together is the commonalities. What seems to be bringing our leaders together is security. So as long as the security is guaranteed, we shall still capture people for smuggling. If you bring your things you can fly with the NIN into Kenya. You cannot take the NIN into Tanzania. You need a proper passport. When students of Makerere maybe are doing field work and go into Kenya and cross into Busia, they'll just have a clearance. They will not be able to do the same for Tanzania. And like someone posted there, while Uganda applies that, all East Africans should pay the same fees. And actually in Ugandan universities we do that. The other universities don't do that in the region. Ugandan students are foreign students and they pay higher fees, or they are blocked out from certain courses. So the issue is we need to know what is it that's bringing us together, and we work together to that. And for me, other than focusing on the challenges and what's not working, it's important to focus on them, but that's for other people. For me, I would love to say what is working and how do we amplify it, because when you look at all the regional blocks in the world, there's nothing that is perfect. They have all worked towards the stages where they are intentionally. You can track the EU, which actually we are following, the customs union. Most of the things we are following in the ESC are very much a blueprint of what the EU did. But the EU from the EEC, you remember, it used to be EEC, then it became EU. It has traveled that journey for more than 50 years. But they are still not perfect. They don't know when to become an EU. They don't know what to keep within the country. They all have differences. So I think we should stop seeing the differences as a challenge, as a problem, as a thing which therefore we can conclude will never work. Society does not function like that. Society is worked upon on a daily basis. So let us be hopeful, and we work and we sensitize and we fix what's not working.
These 8 states, what can unite them? What glue What is the 1, 2, 3 things that can bring these
I
states?
can tell you these states have a lot that is uniting them as East Africans. Okay? As I told you, they have common cultures amongst themselves. They have common economic systems amongst themselves. They are all very informal. They have common languages, not necessarily one language, but Kiswahili is all over the place except here, where we don't really speak it. So they have a lot that is uniting.
We do, some of us.
Thank you. Yeah, I know you grew up with it.
Speak for yourself.
But you see, there's a lot, there's religion, okay? So actually what we need to do, as the politicians are moving and fixing the security things and the big economic things the economists are talking about, we also need to engage the non-state actors, the civic engagement of non-state actors, the religious leaders. Because you see, when it comes to Islam, we don't say that it is Islam of Uganda and Islam of Kenya. It is one Islam, okay? When we talk about things about culture, you know, you always have traditional leaders flying into these countries to do these kinds of things. You just saw at COVID how much we tracked truck drivers and started constructing them as a problem. Truck drivers were actually playing a significant role, or have played a significant role, at uniting this federation, bring these countries together, because they have a family wherever they travel. Now, to the public health people, there is a problem with that. But you see, they are building families at individual level all over. Then in COVID, we started constructing them as a problem. These were people who were simply being East Africans, creating homes everywhere. So I think let us, in addition to the politicians as they sit in their boardrooms and draft these things the way Honorable Mukasambi they talked about them in ways we don't understand, there are also the other leaders who are on the ground who can actually be brought in for civic engagement. Like you've seen how the issues of cattle rustling on the Karamoja-Turkana border, Kenya border, take place within those communities. When those wars flare, it's not just an issue of governments. They also bring in the leaders of those communities to find out what can be done. So let's focus on the positive that's working.
Thank you very much. Dr. Muhumuza, looking at Somalia, that already has Somaliland in another area, it also has 20% of the country run by Al-Shabaab. It also has 3 major problems mentioned by Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, the president: terrorism, debt, and humanitarian issues. What benefit? It has a coastal line of 3,000 kilometers, 17 million people there. Good numbers, very good English to speak about. What does Somalia bring to this EAC, and what does the EAC offer to Somalia?
Well, Timothy, you've really set it up. Somalia is bringing us, you would call them challenges, but they are not new to even us, because there might be Al-Shabaab there. You also have wars in the DRC, North Kivu. We have a lot of issues in South Sudan. Uganda is not having a party in DRC, it's war. The UPDF has been out there. So on that aspect, we level it up, really. We all have those similar challenges. As I said earlier, it would have been good for them to say, yeah, now that we have joined the East African Standby Force that has been in North Kivu, in the DRC, will help us. But even there, as they come, they are already here in DRC saying, well, I would rather bring in SADC. So at least there, the Somali person is not expecting that Al-Shabaab would now be dealt with. They know that is going to be a problem that will continue the way it has been. Are they now going to feel free to move around because they have joined the EAC? They are already here, as she has mentioned. And they didn't come here because they were members of EAC. So a lot of things are going to remain for them as they have been before. But one thing they know, now their presidents would be having regular conversations, at least every year there is a summit. They can sit and have discussions. Whether those discussions translate into tangible benefits to move the lifestyle of a Somali person from one point to another is what possibly many others here in Uganda are still looking for 24 years down the road. There are some who have benefited, but there are those who have not. As Captain mentioned, you would be looking forward to us beginning to discuss, even as we are adding on other countries, tangible things of how do we recreate the East African airlines, because each of these countries is struggling with these airlines. You want to get into those spaces so that your people can begin to feel that you are now discussing substantive issues that affect them. Not that the politics doesn't affect them, it does. How do we begin to discuss the East African railways and harbors? You have a standard gauge in Kenya is stooping there, then you have Uganda here, I'm reviving my own railway line.
1 meter gauge.
All sorts of conversations. The other day I sat with somebody, I said, why are we reviving the old railway line? More than 100 years ago, this thing, Kenya-Uganda, was about copper. So now you want to do again another Kampala to Kasese. To pick what? Let's first answer that question. There is iron ore in Kabale. But it's very difficult to connect from Kabale to Kasese because of the geographical terrain. You are better off possibly starting from Sango Bay in Rakai, going through Isingiro,
yes,
Mirama Hill, and you are in Kabale. And then from Sango Bay, after all, our iron ore is supposed to go to Kenya. Then I pick it by lake and take it to Kisumu. But that conversation should be at the East African level. And these are things I'm looking forward to, rather than us competing. Factories have moved to Kenya. I don't mind factories going to Kenya, but when there is common shareholding, we know our NSSF here has invested across. So it's not the factories in this country or is in that country. Where are the benefits? The benefits can be generated anywhere. As I've said, in the South African Customs Union, Southern Africa, they share those benefits. They have some formulas that will give those benefits. So when are we getting to those practical conversations on how do we build a strong economy? Because it is very clear in the integration that we want to improve the opportunities for our people, economic opportunities, social opportunities, and mention all of them. So can we get to those conversations even as we are adding on new member countries, so that the new member countries are not just being added on because of geographical proximity? You would want to see a country that is even geographically far away from us desiring to join us. I've seen America signing agreements or trade agreements or federations, really, more or less coalitions with Australia. So far away. The North Atlantic Treaty has the entire sea in between it. So can we get to those tangible things like COMESA that anybody else now would want to say, yeah, there is progress in these areas. We are now agreeing, we have done some agreements really. Professor Sali here is saying what is working. We have developed a common infrastructure by plan. When it comes to implementation, God for us all. Each one should do their own thing.
And let me stay with you, Doctor, before I come to Professor Okumu there. Especially on things like flooding markets with produce, protectionism of economies of individual member states. Would specialism be able to solve this economic debacle, non-trade barriers? Would that solve? Because you talked about factories in Kenya. Would that help, especially with these member states?
If we were to get to the fundamentals, like is it standards? I don't mind producing raw materials here, and then they are processed there. And when they are sold, whichever country they are sold to, we all benefit. We have a lot of Chinese manufacturing being offloaded into neighboring countries. Thailand, Vietnam, factories have shifted from, and China is not really that much burden because it's the region benefiting. And if these people do not benefit, as we have already said, you'll have a problem of the Americans who are trying to build a wall on the southern border. If America had taken the Asian approach of saying, I'm not going to grow alone in this space, let's try and grow together. Because China has really been building a lot of roads and railways in neighboring countries. Japan has been strengthening their growth in those Asian countries. America decided, I will grow alone here, you guys in Latin America, you'll have a problem. And every other day, we see migrations moving in. Now, similarly, that can happen within this region. Especially now that there are certain pockets that are politically and militarily insecure. People will move where they think they are looking for security. But once they move looking for security, then they are going to affect the economics of those countries where they are coming, straining their social services, but also undermining the growth opportunities of where they have left. So can we begin to bring up those other aspects that is not just political counting of numbers and presidents, but join to the saying, how do we develop this region? We have Karuma Dam, a very big dam. Uganda has surplus power. We did this, the conversations 20 years ago was we are going to sell it to the neighborhood. It hasn't materialized. Now we are stuck with a lot of power, with a lot of debt to pay. All the formulas didn't work out. Now, how do you get those additional benefits, which to a citizen actually mean everything of a federation? She just mentioned about the Schengen. Now, me and Uganda, and I get a Schengen visa to one country, I can move to all of them. Now, the European Union don't even need visas. When you are there, you just see them raise their passports and cross. When are we getting to those levels that a citizen would move? But also, it's not just about free movement of citizens. Why am I moving?
Goods and services.
Why am I moving? Must I move? Because if you are moving because you are running out from war, then the bridge is not doing the favor that you would want to. You want to move because there is an economic or social opportunity there. As she has mentioned, we are integrated. When you come to parts of Western Kenya, you find names from Soroti. You may think you have already entered Uganda because the names are so familiar. So you want to know you are going to be visiting your relative the other side, or you're going for medical treatment, just chat and tour. But we still have all these things that a plane starting from Kajansi to Kisumu is an international flight. And that comes with extra costs. If it was just gazetted as a domestic flight, maybe it would cost $100. But now, because it's an international flight, it must start from Entebbe.
Doctor,
when are we resolving those issues?
What areas would these countries specialize in? Because when you look at hospitality, it's Kenya. When you look at the service industry in banking, it's Kenya. And you've said it very well. When you go to Kakamega, you'll find a Nyangweso. You come to Busia, you'll find one. What areas should these countries specialize in your view? What should we be focusing on, where our strengths are as member states, so that we can be able to leverage even better?
We actually already have some specialities. Sometimes mindsets take us back. Uganda is an agricultural country. But somehow somebody has put it upon Ugandan elites that agriculture is a bad thing. You must industrialize. Until Ukraine fought with Russia, people knew those were industrialized countries. Then we realized much as they are industrialized, they have massive agricultural potential. The two countries produce 70% of the world's wheat. Now, Kenya is Uganda's biggest destination of exports. 26% of our exports go to Kenya. You want to ask, what is it that we are selling to Kenya? Certainly not vehicles, not phones, not cables. I want to believe the bulk of that is food. Following Kenya is the South Sudan, is DRC. About 25% of our exports going to DRC. Not Europe, not America, even as AGOA goes away. And then 22% is going into. So you're looking at almost a big percentage of our exports going to these countries. Now, their integration would really serve us. But you need to come back and say, what should I specialize in? Now, you are here spending a lot of your money on industrial parks. Yet really, you are all hanging fruit. Kenya is in need of Ugandan food. Forget about aflatoxin. That's something we can fix. And sometimes they raise it whenever they have a surplus. But even I've seen, and we've been doing a study at the UNIMS Forum on maize, it is very rare to find exporters of maize to Kenya. But when you flip over to Kenya, you find the importers. Because Kenyans are actually coming here and producing their own maize and taking it away. So when are we going to realize that we can actually feed the region, leverage agricultural products, and then see what others can bring to us? Services. Makerere is still having the potential in this region. So we can specialize in that. I see everybody going, many people, not everybody. Honorable said we speak for ourselves. People go to Aga Khan Hospital. So when you get into the service area, what can Uganda leverage? You have mentioned banking for Kenya. Now everybody is like, Kenya is doing the banks. What can Uganda do in the service area?
Higher education.
We can find something else. You don't have to compete because it's a regional thing. But everybody is now talking about what is not working, or what is working, you want to put it down instead of amplifying it. So for me, if we sat down to say, can we have a common plan for East Africa? Now Uganda has its national development plan, backed up by Buy Uganda, Build
Uganda.
Kenya is Buy Kenya, Build Kenya. Tanzania is also doing it. When are we going to get like we did the master plan for infrastructure? Much as we abandoned it in implementation, but at least we have done it. Now can we sit and do a master plan for the 8 countries? Then that will help us to begin saying, where is the market for what? Who has potential to do what? Where should we do the livestock? I still look back in time when there was East African meat packers in Soroti.
Okay. Professor Okumu, let's come to the question of security. When you look at Somalia, the first thing that drops in anyone's mind is Al-Shabaab. God rest his soul in peace, general that passed away, called the Lion of Mogadishu. One of the things that is there is clans that have mercenaries there that tend to take over there. DRC is the same. Recently, we've just had the EAC force is being chased out. SADC is coming in, come the 8th of December. Security-wise.
In the communique, it is slightly different. What is being said there? What they have now said is that SADC and the East African regional force should get together, and the leaders of those should actually come out with a plan to help DRC.
Thank you, Captain Babu. We seem to have pockets of crisis in terms of terrorism. Can security be handled, or is this a viability for Uganda to become a superpower in crisis?
Well, my response to that, first of all, is that I'm not a security expert. but be it as it may, pockets of security have an economic connotation. And the way I see it, again, is in the context of regional integration, in the sense that regional integration allows for, one, freedom of movement. And the freedom of movement typically is in the quest for opportunity. And what that does is that now that Somalia is coming on board, DRC is coming on board, to suggest that with only national ID of any one of those countries, you can cross the border without being asked questions that they would typically be asked, to the extent that some of them are now refugees in Uganda, so to speak. Now, having said that, for as long as we can settle the question of employability, for as long as we can settle the question of productive engagement, then in a way we would have moved a mile to address the security question. Reason being that the survival of Al-Shabaab, the survival of conflict in Eastern Congo, the instability in Southern Sudan is partly because of marauding youths that are not being economically productive. Now, if the community can give those nascent economies the opportunity to grow and consequently create jobs for their youths, then in a way we would have achieved a pacification of those new and young members of the community.
And sticking to that, Professor Okumu, 2 coastal lines. When you look at DRC, a coastal line there. When you look at Somalia, a coastal line. How does this bloc or its 8 member states take advantage of this to especially improve trade across?
What I can say about that is that, one, lessons can be learned from Mombasa Port, lessons can be learned from Dar es Salaam Port, but most importantly is that the coast on the Atlantic side,
Matadi,
that is
the place.
DRC.
It's called Matadi.
Yes, that is DRC. Again, it gives us accessibility to other continents. So there are opportunities here. And to suggest that there isn't any competition per se, rather I see them as opportunities, more so to the extent that the leading port here is certainly Mombasa, right? What lessons can we pick from Mombasa port and then translate them to the port on the DRC side, to the extent that whatever is produced in Uganda, and we must use the Atlantic Ocean, then it is the case that we use the port on the Atlantic Ocean. But most importantly, again, is that the infrastructure that links the different countries is extremely important. Look, I go to Jinja pretty much every weekend, and the road between Kampala and Jinja is chaotic. But Uganda's biggest trade is on the northern corridor. That's where we move our exports, that's where we move our imports. How much of that goes into the cost of production? So it doesn't matter how many potential ports that you might have, but for as long as the linkage between the hinterland and the port is weak, then the port will largely operate under excess capacity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Honorable Mukasambide, when we look at now 8 member states of the EAC, what advantages do we get? Because now we seem to be, and looking at the criteria, regional proximity, human rights, rule of law, interdependence with the EAC, good governance, is this enough for us to be able to bring in everyone? Because Ethiopia is around the corner.
Yes.
And Angola.
Yes. Of course, even Central African Republic and Zambia applied earlier.
That's right.
In fact, to join the old East African Community that collapsed in '77. You asked very fundamental questions. Something to do with the, and I would like, of course, also to highlight it the more, because the professor said he's not really competent on security matters. I would like to also add on further incompetence to the extent that the viewers will definitely benefit. The entry by Somalia, then Al-Shabaab. First of all, viewers need to know what is Shabaab. Shabaab is it is an Arabic word meaning youth. Now, what is it? What is it that has made it? What are the objective reasons that have made it a logical necessity for the young people to provide a fertile recruitment ground for such activities in Somalia? Unemployment is one of them. So the question is, what comes first? We used to debate that as a question in primary school. What came first? What did God create first? Was it the egg or the chicken? For me, I would always debate. I would say, no, in my opinion, I think he created the chicken first. They would ask why. I said, because he would not suffer the embarrassment of sitting on an egg trying to hatch it. So he created the chicken to do its job. So in my opinion, I think what should then come first is the integration process. For purposes that then concerted efforts will solve the unemployment problem to the extent then that the young people will never continue to be a fertile recruitment ground for criminal activities. Now, when you look at Somalia, of course, we have been debating the coastline. The coastline, 3,303
yes.
kilometers. Adding now to a coastline of course, Kenya and Tanzania, 1,420, 1,428, then the 37 kilometers of DRC. That one merged all together, I think we can beat Ukraine of 2,700. We can. So we are dealing with the coastline. If Africa were serious, we would be harnessing our own coastline, which is closer to 30,000 kilometers. Of course, still half of European coastline. And they claim that because our continent is bigger, it should have had a bigger coastline than actually what is being depicted in the books. But they say ours is tainted with the harbors and the gulfs. So, in my own opinion, these are things we ought to have done earlier than we have done then. For purposes then that would have solved the problems that we are already facing, that we would not have faced in the circumstances. We will continue to deal with problems of trade imbalances. Yes, that exists. Even during the old economic, of course, integration process, we still had. For example, Kenya, it is said in between 1967 and 77, Kenya, real GDP was 7.5, as opposed to Tanzania and Uganda that we are dealing with the 2.0. So that means still the trade imbalance would exist. But at the same time, what are we doing? We have been citing, the United States, of course, is dealing, it has harnessed its population to the extent that then that population is interpreted as a market for its own product. The volume of transactions in the United States, of course, compared to the population of the United States of 40 million people, compared now to the one of the East African community of 490, if we raised the GDP per capita of our populations, then we would be dealing with a huge market for our own products. Now, people should know. I have written, first of all, a book which is about to be launched officially, the East African Community, a sine qua non of integration. Integration is not a choice for the East Africans. No. It is a supposition. This is something that we ought to have done. We have no choice but to do it anyway. Of course, we will still continue to deal with our leaders that don't want to cede power. Does it shock you that in the whole of the East African community, only one country is dealing with is administering an administration of what we call decentralization? It is only Kenya. All the other countries are just doing deconcentration. They are still running their own same. They are running. Unitary. The central government is continuing to run districts, while deconcentrating the running centers from State House, but running them from the districts themselves. Now, people think that is decentralization. It is not. It is deconcentration. Decentralization is where the substantive units are given authority to run. We don't have it here, we don't have it elsewhere, except Kenya, where they have tried, of course, what used to be called Majimboism, but now it is working.
Majimbo is federal.
Yes. So Kenya is doing it better. And the professors have been good. What is it that we are doing? Because once integration is actually put in place, then we must have choices in terms of comparative advantage. We cannot begin running like, because industrializing at the same time, trying to agriculture, but at the same time, still continuing to maintain our own land tenure systems that were decisions that were established primitively by primitive administrations of the past. You hear leaders say that actually this land is for clans. So in Uganda, it is very impossible, and I don't believe that should be done to the extent that there are regions that are no-go areas for Ugandans. Now, if we establish such regions as no-go areas for Uganda in terms of settlement and of course, even utilization of land, of course, they are confusing two things, land ownership and land use. The two are not a problem. They can actually be used and harnessed simultaneously to the extent that benefits accrue to either. But primitively still, people still look at land as a small god of some sort. They want to, of course, when you come to Buganda here, everybody can show you his piece of land by showing you a few bushes. Then when you pass, then there are some hills. Instead of showing you actually what obtained is on the ground, productive capacity of land is not being harnessed and utilized. So in so doing, we are failing to benefit from the integration process established. If you have nothing to sell, what do we do with you? Of course, Uganda, you are talking of one East African community language. When we have a country in the whole East African community singing its national anthem in English, this is the only country which English is understood by less than 30% of Ugandans. How national is such a song? Yes, less.
That's too much.
And that is too much, according to Captain. So that, I have heard people singing our national anthem, Mo Uganda, Gotapoti, Will. Now, meaning people don't even know the kind, what actually is enshrined in the national anthem itself. It is not national, it's not even regional. You cannot even equate it to a district in terms of how many people understand what it is in the process. So, there are a lot of things that we need to do. The problems are not restricted to East Africa. The whole sub-region economics that we are trying to establish, African Continental Free Trade Area, it is established. When you look at the first 100 global companies, we don't have an African company. Then we are joking. So, but at least we will still continue to make sure we are moving. Other problems that we look at structurally, and I raised it with the council to the community. For example, when we are enacting our own, and I think the doctor there raised something to do with trying to benchmark European Union, thinking we are establishing something akin to what they are doing. There is a provision, the principle of variable geometry that we established in our treaty. That principle is a problem. If we want to integrate, it states that we can, of course, agree. We all agree, we agree by consensus. But in terms of implementation, each and every country can begin to implement as and when in practice, as and when it can do so. Now, for me, again, it's the same. East African Community needs to move at the same pace. Once we take decisions on, and agreements on what has been negotiated and signatures appended to it, we must move on the same equal footing. Why variable geometry? When we establish that we have signed, we have appended signatures to a common market, in a monetary union protocol, for example, we have fully benchmarked, we have established a convergence criteria, we know the interoperability we have established at a level of Exchequer Board of Bank of East Africa, equalization formulas and what, then we must move on. Why are we leaving any country to choose a date on which it will begin or commence its own? So I think that is where jokes, of course, now set in.
Before I get to Captain Babu, Honorable Mbide, the question of funds.
Yes.
Tanzania is withholding. Countries are refusing to contribute. This is one of the problems between 1967 and 1977.
Yes.
And
others are forgiven.
I wasn't going there, but how do we resolve this problem? Because this federation needs to be financed.
It is a just commitment. Because the summit of the heads of state at one time had taken a decision for purposes that actual remittances should not be by way of subventions from partner states, but they should be percentages at collection levels of taxation, of taxes of substantive partner states. If South Sudan has just been forgiven, but you know, if, for example, a percentage of its own tax had been reserved for purposes of remittances on the quotas that are required from South Sudan, I am telling you that I know that given the international commodity price volatility of oil, still South Sudan is able to pay. It has got generals that are actually richer than certain ministries in South Sudan. We know they could pay.
It's called middle class.
Yes. There was a time we actually confronted the president, and he almost gave us the money in cash until we advised that actually it is not possible. This has to be remitted to the Minister of Finance.
These people don't know the proverb which says, so when a madman gives you, you take it there.
We are not, the law would not allow. So I can tell you that even Somalia can be able to pay.
Okay.
If commitment exists.
Captain Francis Babu, let me bring you in on the national versus the East African bloc. Every country will have a protectionism of what it has. How do we have a balance act of a nation versus the bloc in all spheres?
Yes, first of all, we've got to be honest. You know, I like that Singapore thing, which talked about meritocracy, it talks about pragmatism, and talks about honesty. Now, we have to be honest when we want to create the bloc. But let me very quickly, I wanted to say this because this summit, you know, there's a communique. And one of the things in the communique talks about the language. We now have 3 languages which are national. We start with English, French, and Swahili. Those now are the 3 languages in the bloc. Secondly, I want to talk about that security question you asked my friend there. It talks about the East African community, I mean the DRC Congo, saying that they don't, by the 8th of December, the East African Regional Force will not be allowed to continue. So the summit, the heads of state directed that the East African Community Force and the SADC should sit down, map out a way forward, and give it to the heads of state as soon as possible.
The challenge with that is that President Tshisekedi is the one who made the communication that the contract of the East African Force is done. So will the EAC...
No, but these are all of them now, including Tshisekedi's representative.
That's why I'm asking, will the EAC communique overshadow what the president of the state has said? That's why I was asking about the national versus the EAC bloc.
No, I'm sure when they made this communique, they had already discussed it. You know, they discuss it, then they make the communique. The representative from Congo, DRC, was there. And they have agreed that this is what they're going to do. So the SADC, the leaders of SADC forces and the East African are going to sit down and map out a way forward. Whether it is SADC or whether it is whatever they agree, they will communicate to us. The other point I wanted to make about is about this divide and rule. You know, Africans, I think we are naive. After Berlin, they never wanted us to be one. They have never wanted it. And they will not allow it if they can. So we've got to sit down and say, wait a minute. We as Africans, by uniting, we become much more stronger. Now this argument about the youth, we have also ADF here. Most of the fighters are youth. You go, you go to Boko Haram in Nigeria, most of them are youth. The question is, how can we sit with our people and sensitize them so that they know that dividing our country is not the answer? The next point, which is very, very important, when they are talking about a confederation now, or the confederation means the states remain with more power than the center. The question is that going to help us to cement a good regional integration? Or this constitution which they are talking about, because in the communique, they talked about certain countries speeding up the constitutional making process. The question now is, why should we stop at confederation? Why don't we go all the way to federation? Now let me tell you the importance of federation here, in my opinion. If we could get to the federation level, Congo, the answer to Congo's problem starts with the federation. If we can have a federal DRC and had eastern, southern, or whatever, all the areas, and each one of them has got certain power, you might reduce this problem that is going on. I mean, Somalia, the youth. Who said you cannot talk to our own youth? So, who is dividing this youth? That's another question. Who is dividing our youth in Africa? Are we dividing them ourselves? Or is there another force creating insecurity so that we do not integrate? So the question here is very important. And the different presidents were talking. And they said, one of the things we have to do, and very quickly, is to sit down with the different groups that are fighting in this part of the world and find out what really is the problem. And also find out who is pushing them. Who is pushing Al-Shabaab? Who is pushing ADF? Who is pushing M23? Who is pushing all? By the way, it's not only those, there are others. From Kalemi on the Tanzanian border, in the Congo side, all the way to Kivu, all the way to Bunia, you have small groups that are fighting. The question is, how do we get to the bottom? This is why I told you earlier on, we need a strong political group. This summit must become a little bit more realistic. We need a revolution here to go and sit down and find out where the problem is coming from. And if they know, which I think they do, because they all have intelligence, then we should sit down and find solution to all these little problems, because one of the presidents said we need peace and security for the East African community to move forward. Now, all these symptoms we are talking about, and the Tanzanian president was very clear. He said, in our unity, is more important than us not uniting. And she was very clear about this. So, as far as I'm concerned, and this is, you asked for a solution. These countries you're talking about, they want examples of serious leadership that brings an answer to this integration which they will benefit from. Those societies that live on our so-called borders, they are already doing it. They say, now we understand, now we see our leaders are serious about this. So our local people, let's say Uganda, for example, if they saw the benefit that can come out of the East African community, our traders of maize, of milk, of what, if they can see the benefit, they will go with the integration. So integration needs practical solutions, not theoretical solutions, not paper signing. What we want is come out and find out what is causing all this insecurity you're talking about, one. And two, get the people like Southern Sudan. Why do they keep on fighting? They are fighting themselves. And you know there are people who are making them fight because of the oil.
Okay.
So we need to find solution to all these problems.
Thank you, Captain. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to give you parting shots even as we close the show. I'll start with Professor Dr. Mhumza, Professor Kumu, Honorable Mbide, and finally Captain Francis Babu.
Thank you very much, Timothy. Just in brief, I think I would want to reiterate what we said earlier, define what is bringing us together. Beyond the security, we have a lot of commonalities. We have a lot of shared values that we can amplify. Number two, we need to stop majoring in minors. We need to stop focusing on what doesn't work and focus on what works. Part of the reason the youth in the region are being taken up by those kinds of things is, for starters, Africa is a young continent. Its population is very young, but it has limited opportunities. And because of limited opportunities, the youth are always being conscripted into things or being made to feel they are dispossessed, they are where they are because the other group is doing better. So they will keep fighting them. So what is the way, one way we can stop that happening or arrest it in its tracks is providing opportunities for people. We have tried going it as solo countries, it hasn't worked. So let us try the integration, and I'm more hopeful that the integration will provide more trade, but also more opportunities for collaboration at higher level, higher elite level of academics, but also at lower level of smaller people, SMEs. Right now, if you look at the East African Index, there are many SMEs that are providing mentorship to younger people that our people can register in from different countries. So a lot is happening. We need to track it and see, and all of this, by the way, is cost-free. So there's everyone interested in working in that. So then, the other thing that makes me more hopeful is that Africa has embarked on Africa's major infrastructure project. And there is the whole aspect of the Trans-African highways that is being forecasted. That is for the next 30 years. Maybe is when the project will be complete. But it has started. And when you look at this map, it is about connecting Africa and across. Because we basically trade with outsiders because we don't have much connection internally. So there are all these things, you know, there's a planned route from Lagos to Kampala to Mombasa via Yaoundé, via Benin. There is the other one coming from the north, there is Casablanca to Rabat, from Rabat to Dakar. So there are many. If you look at that map, I will share the map with you. So there are many, plus of course the African Free Trade Continental Area, Africa. So there are a lot of initiatives that are being embarked on to create opportunities. And these initiatives will be better realized when we get together as a trading bloc. And I think for me, finally, let's focus on the opportunities. You know, in every situation, there are those who are looking for opportunities within that situation. There are those who are looking at challenges and why it doesn't work. So a lot is happening on the continent if you're just on those pages and those networks. So let us focus on that, and Federation provides the opportunity in terms of trade, in terms of opportunities of trade, education, and everything. Let us focus on what is working and amplify it and strengthen it and make it work. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Mhumza and Professor Okuma, I hope you can hint on the currency. I'll start with you, Dr. Mhumza, and then Professor Okuma.
Which currency now?
The monetary union.
You know, the monetary union won't be coming that soon because the conditions to get to a monetary union are very clear. what percentage of debt to GDP do you have? Each of these countries has really ramped up their debt away from what you would need to get into a monetary union. The good thing about monetary union and those macroeconomic issues, you cannot just determine yourself. Because now you can't bring, the Kenyan shilling has lost value maybe 20% in the last few months. Goods are now cheaper in Kenya. You'd rather go and buy things in Kenya and bring to Uganda, you get better value. Now, by the time the European Union went to the same currency, the euro, they had done a lot of basics. You don't see us walking into that direction. So as you're saying, bringing these countries together is going to take commitment of the leaders. As somebody has said before, leadership is everything, the rest are symptoms. So you don't even want to begin discussing railways and I don't know what, leadership. If the leadership in Africa can't come up to stand for Africa, then the symptoms will continue becoming the common notion. And this is why the shababs, the young people, have lost trust really. So you've seen them in West Africa. They have taken over. Coups are back and people are really debating, are coups bad or good? We all had agreed coups are bad. But now we have reached a level where you're like, solution. Maybe they are not that bad. Because the leadership, really where it has taken the continent, is in a situation that no youth wants to be. And that's why we're seeing very many African youth migrating even out of the continent and leaving their countries. And some of them are hope and stepping from one country to another country. When are we going to stabilize it? It's going to be leadership for me. And if the leadership can sit down and sort out that space, the rest will fall into place. Otherwise, we don't want to deal with symptoms.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mhumza. Professor Kum.
Thank you, Timothy. Once again, for me, the key question is the EAC bloc still relevant? And the answer is strongly yes. Why? If you look at a country like Tanzania, for instance, it earns about $2.5 billion from tourism. And Uganda is hovering about $1 billion. I don't know how much Somalia earns on account of conflict. I don't know how much DRC earns on account of conflict. But most important here is that if we can agree as a community and market the region as a community, we can leverage the frontier activities that Tanzania is doing across the region and market the region as a tourism hub. Secondly, is that typical of the EAC countries is homogeneity in terms of the kind of commodities that we are selling. It's coffee, it is tea, among others. Now, that could be a hindrance to trade. But even then, there are opportunities that could arise. For instance, we have Chira Motors, Rwanda is doing VW, Kenya is assembling Isuzu. Within that, one could ask the question, how is it that these countries can climb into the global value chains? Within that, small products like U-boats or boats, so to speak, it's possible that our economies can start picking on some of those products as a way of engaging in product differentiation so as to sustain the momentum of the ESC. But having said that, like I said earlier, it is important that we have a harmonization of quality standards such that when a commodity crosses Mombasa, when a commodity crosses Dar es Salaam port, when a commodity crosses the DRC port, it's not subjected to subsequent phytosanitary standard checking to waste time. Secondly, we need to have standards across the capacity development frameworks to the extent that if one is trained an engineer, whether it's in Somalia, South Sudan, Tanzania, the movement of labor is easy on account of the fact that the curriculum is standardized across the region. And to the extent that when someone is a plumber in Kenya, they can be a plumber in Somalia. You know, that builds confidence across the region, because you have a regional product of a lawyer, you have a regional product of an engineer, among others. But most importantly is, again, to smoothen the movement of goods is the need to leverage digitalization. Now, within this investment in digitalization, of course, depends on bandwidth, right? And for a single country, it can be expensive. However, if we leverage the community and engage in East Africa community-wide investment, then the unit cost of production again becomes smaller. The same can be applied to the airline, as I said earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Honorable Mbide.
Yes. One thing that the viewers need to know, for me, what is perturbing me are the problems that have been overly cited, for example, in Eastern Congo, regarding M23. M23, to some people, they may think it is something of now, M23 stands for March 23rd. That is an agreement that had been entered into by certain Congolese citizens, and accordingly formed a joint government in Congo, which agreement was dishonored and they ran away from administration, protecting their own people, ethnic groups, by the way, against, of course, upheavals orchestrated by the National Army, FADC, in conjunction by way of mercenary forces with FDLR, those that had run away from Rwanda. So it is just a management problem. Just recently, President Tshisekedi of DRC appointed Major General Floribert Chesembo as the head of operations in northern Equator in Congo DRC. Until he was tapped on the shoulder and told that actually, Your Excellency, that Major General was killed in 2011. You know, the guy had been appointed by a presidential decree just recently. Then the president was told that actually that one was, Mr. President, that one was killed in 2011 when he was trying again to do subversive activities against the state. Now, if a dead person can be appointed to head an operation
by a living person,
then you know there is a management problem. And this has to be solved if East African community is to flourish. Because when they tell you that the threshold of life of the EAC Standard Forces is December 8th, which is just underway.
Next week.
And that the chiefs of defense forces must sit, and defense ministers, and definitely what they come up with should be in a position to brief the summit. Now, we don't know when the summit is going to sit again. And the Congo DRC is actually under an election period. I can tell you, if anybody wants to know, the Congolese army, which is made up of majorly 3 battalions, this is an army that is being given almost $1 billion per year by United States.
Only.
In aid. And that money cannot be accounted for. It is corruption, mismanagement, and all that. And it is the East African community that can aid. And management is actually the answer. A standard brigade can still be created, as one was created in 2012, flashed out to M23, but these are citizens. What happened? They are back. They took over Goma, they took over what? And now, of course, by way of talks, the situation has normalized. What will happen now is that obviously they will take over, and I think South Africa and of course contributions from Angola and Tanzania, that notwithstanding, I don't think now in Tanzania we have got a leader that is capable of doing the things that other leaders used to do. Against, of course, the aspirations of the EAC, I hope. So in my opinion, there is a management question that has to be quickly answered.
Okay.
Before we get to think about, of course, the East African community, as including the Congo DRC. Number 2, still, it is a question of what happened. It is colonialists that decided that these are citizens, and by 1960, Congo DRC created its own citizens by way of a constitution establishment in 1960. Other than the 1884 Berlin Conference and the decisions, and all of us were considered liberals. And you see, when we decided now to make sure that that 8 countries should gear towards becoming one country, then we cannot begin pointing out citizens that should not be part of the citizenry of just a single entity. So for me, it becomes lackadaisical. We must be in a position to tell the people where we are going without actually looking back. They say when you look back and you begin moving, that is where you will go. So integration means forgetting the past and moving forward, and moving for real, and not simply verbally.
Thank you very much. Lastly, Captain Francis.
Thank you very much. Mama Hassan said that the factors that bring East Africans together outweigh those that sets them apart. I think I like that. There are more that put us together. But at the same time, I want you to know, my brother here is very good. He talked about money coming from the United States to finance an army of a country. What is the United States looking for in that country? When they land aeroplanes in forests to take minerals. Who? Why should foreigners make us decide? Another point, I want to respect our heads of state who sat in Arusha and agreed. They have said, the president of Congo has asked the East African Regional Force to stop by the 8th of December. The SADC has been asked to come in. This whole group, including DRC Congo, sat down and agreed that their army and the ministers of defense, before the 8th of December, must come up with a solution to the problem of the Congo. Now, these other unfortunate problems which are there because of mismanagement, those are everywhere. But then there's a lot of mismanagement in each one of these countries. So I'm not going to go for that. I'm going to go for the positive. This group, when they sit down, they'll give us a way forward on how to control the M23 problem. I am very sympathetic to the M23. I'm also sympathetic to Congo as a country for having that problem. And I've told you, to me, I think the best thing for Congo is to have a federal government and divide that country so that it is equal. The other point, you are talking about M23, I'm talking about ADF, I'm talking about Al-Shabaab. But lastly but not least, the most important thing, and we have to become programmatic, I am still concerned with the structure that the East African community wants to set up, the political structure. I am completely disturbed by this word called confederation. We have always waited for the word federation. Now, how quickly are we going to go from federation, from confederation to federation? Because the argument is, because of what is going on, we start with the confederation and we drive towards federation. My argument is very simple. Why don't we take the bull by the horn and go straight away for the federation? And stop this confederation? Because to me, that's a delaying tactic. Our aim was to go all the way to federation, and we need the monetary system. The other day I was listening to this gentleman called PLO Lumumba, professor. He said we have 23 currencies in Africa, and which cannot be used even for trade. And those 23 currencies have got central banks. And all those central banks are Mickey Mouse. Now, that was a terrible way to describe our currencies. So the monetary union is extremely important for the East African community. The quicker we do it, the better it is for our trade. The other important thing, and the president brought it up, he said our cultures, our people in East Africa must be united, this point I brought earlier on. The quicker we start going towards that unity is extremely important. And lastly but not least, we must be honest when we go for the integration. We should stop selfish. And if you like, that selfishness is the weakness. Now you are talking about America making us decide how we can find the solutions in Congo. Let these heads of state find the solution in Congo. Let it not be the American. Let it not be. Now, someone talked about the young people in West Africa. Those boys realized a long time ago the problem is not Africans, it is France.
Okay. Let me get some feedback so that we can be able to call it an evening. I'm engineer Wako. I'm watching from Nairobi. The professor said that students at Makerere pay fees that are lower, but international students, even us who have come there, pay higher fees than the locals. Okay, thank you very much. Timothy, once a country joins the EAC, they should cease calling themselves Ugandans, Kenyans, Tanzanians, and become East Africans.
Correct.
But this isn't happening, and that's why protectionism is happening. We belong to the EAC and still want to compete among ourselves. Ronald Mivule, an activist for regional integration there. Okay, this will be the final one there. Good evening, Timothy. This is James from Manafa. Professor is very close, I think Professor and Dr. Muhumza are very close to the PSST, and can he remind him to rejuvenate the promised economy that works to achieve competitive advantage for us? Finally, the most advanced economic bloc on the continent does not deserve the cynicism that I am getting from this panel, especially considering that the community is in its formative years. Thank you for the show. This is Joseph from Ranshamire. Thank you very much, Joseph. Gentlemen and lady, thank you very much for coming. We appreciate that you graced us to be able to discuss these patent issues, but also the team behind that has ensured today happens. We'll end it this way. The grass is greener where you water it. The grass is greener where you water it. Good morning.
𝐓𝐡𝐞 Bus Industries Namambe, the manufacturers of buses for transporters, schools, tour operators and special purpose vans. 𝐓𝐡𝐞 Bus Industries offers a range of buses known for safety, comfort and reliability. Depending on your needs, a bus can simply be a point A to point B people mover, with just seats or a special design that includes a restroom, power outlet, Wi-Fi, television and a refreshment center. Buy your buses from 𝐓𝐡𝐞 and support industrialization of Uganda.
UBC, inspiring Uganda.
Name is not even mentioned here.
The representative from the U.S. notably said that Washington strongly opposes the advancement of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, but didn't explain why the U.S. hasn't done anything to put a stop to their allies' actions. Meanwhile, Russia's representative to the UN argued that the U.S. and its Western allies haven't done more to try to protect Palestinian civilians because they see them as second-class citizens.